J.D. Vance asked Gavin Newsom one question on live television, and suddenly the man openly positioning himself as a future president of the United States had nothing useful to say. The question was not about a sex scandal, a criminal investigation, a leaked email, or some obscure controversy his staff could dismiss as partisan noise because Vance went after something much simpler and therefore much harder to escape: arithmetic. California had spent roughly $37 billion on homelessness, while approximately 187,000 people remained homeless, a figure that works out to nearly $197,000 for every person still living in shelters, tents, cars, doorways, and encampments across the state. That is enough money, in much of America, to buy a house outright, yet homelessness in California had not disappeared, had not even meaningfully retreated, and instead had continued moving in the wrong direction while the spending climbed higher. So Vance asked the question that should have been asked years earlier, the question buried under press releases, task forces, slogans, emergency declarations, and glossy program names. Where did the money go, Governor? That question hit because California's own oversight system had already supplied the brutal context, and the context was worse than any partisan attack Vance could have invented. The problem was not merely that billions had been spent with disappointing results, because governments waste money all the time and usually survive by calling failure a pilot program, a transition period, or an implementation challenge. The deeper problem was that the state had failed to consistently track spending and outcomes across major homelessness programs, meaning the public was being asked to trust a system that could not clearly show what happened after the checks were written. Billions went out, homelessness went up, reporting remained fragmented, and when a legislator tried to impose stronger annual accountability requirements, Newsom vetoed the measure instead of welcoming the scrutiny. Gavin Newsom was not being trapped by some clever rhetorical trick. He was being confronted with the consequences of spending at a scale large enough to transform the problem and managing it with a level of accountability too weak to explain why the transformation never came. And then came the part that made the entire confrontation so devastating. Newsom had been winning before Vance started counting. For the first 11 minutes of the town hall, the California governor looked exactly like the national candidate he has spent years preparing to become: standing tall, moving confidently, using his hands, controlling his cadence, and filling the room with the polished energy of a politician who understands television almost as well as he understands politics. He spoke about California's economy, its place among the largest economies in the world, its technology sector, its climate agenda, its innovation, its influence, and its supposed role as a living demonstration that progressive governance could deliver results at scale. He said innovation again and again, spoke repeatedly about the future, and framed California not as a state struggling under unresolved contradictions, but as the laboratory where the rest of the country could supposedly see tomorrow arriving early. Every sentence was smooth, every transition practiced, every statistic selected to reinforce the same national message. California works, therefore Gavin Newsom works, and America should consider giving him a larger stage. At 58 years old and 6'3", Newsom did not need to announce that the town hall was an audition because everything about the performance already made that obvious. America was the audience. The presidency was the destination no one needed to name. And for 11 minutes, the choreography was working exactly as intended because the discussion remained where Newsom is strongest: scale, ambition, aspiration, national comparisons, broad narratives, and the language of historical momentum. Then the moderator turned to Vance, and the rhythm broke, not because Vance shouted, interrupted, or launched into some theatrical counterattack, but because he looked down at his laptop and stayed there for several seconds. He was not studying Newsom's expression, not playing to the gallery, not searching for the camera, and not trying to manufacture a viral moment through body language. He was doing something far more dangerous to a politician built around narrative control. He was checking the numbers. Vance began by conceding what was true, which immediately made the attack harder to dismiss as ideological theater. California did have one of the largest economies in the world, and Newsom was correct to say so, but California also had the largest homeless population of any state in the country. Roughly 187,000 people sleeping in shelters or on the streets on any given night, a fact the governor had not included in his celebration of the California model. Then Vance drew the line that would define the rest of the night. Newsom had spent 5 minutes telling the audience what California was, and Vance would spend his time explaining what California cost. That distinction stripped away the language of prestige and forced the conversation toward the one territory where slogans become liabilities. Because once the question is cost, every promise eventually has to meet a ledger. In the green room, Newsom's deputy chief of staff, Jake Ellison, reportedly understood the shift immediately. This was not functioning like a debate anymore. It was becoming an audit. That difference mattered because a debate can be won with timing, confidence, pivots, emotional framing, and the disciplined refusal to answer the question your opponent actually asked. An audit is different because an audit does not care whether the governor looks presidential, whether the audience likes his tone, or whether the program name sounds compassionate. An audit asks what was spent, where it went, what happened afterward, and whether the books reconcile. Vance began reading from public records, state budget documents, auditor reports, and investigations, laying out the central arithmetic without decoration. Since 2019, California had spent approximately $37 billion on homelessness programs, while the homeless population rose from roughly 151,000 to 187,000. That meant tens of thousands more people were homeless after years of massive public expenditure, a result so difficult to defend that the political system had survived largely by discussing the spending and the suffering separately. Vance put them on the same screen, in the same sentence, at the same time, and suddenly the contradiction could no longer hide behind bureaucratic distance. Then he did what almost nobody in California politics had apparently bothered to do in front of a national audience. He divided. $37 billion against the size of the homeless population produced a per-person figure so large that the abstraction disappeared. Because once the public hears billions, the number often becomes too enormous to feel real. But once that total is translated into the cost attached to one human being, the scale becomes impossible to ignore. Depending on the population baseline used, the spending approached a figure large enough to purchase a median-priced home in a majority of American states, and Vance put those comparisons on the screen one after another, turning a policy failure into arithmetic any viewer could understand without a graduate degree in public administration. Ohio, Michigan, Texas, Tennessee, state after state appeared beside home price figures that made the same point with almost insulting simplicity. California had spent enough money on paper to create life-changing housing value on an enormous scale, yet the streets were still full and the encampments were still there. The state had spent like a government solving the problem and produced results like a government still trying to locate the problem. Then Vance introduced Dorothy Chen, a retired elementary school teacher in Sacramento who had spent 34 years teaching third grade before retiring in 2021. Her pension brought in about $3,400 a month. Her rent consumed around $1,900 of it, more than half her income, and her savings stood at roughly $87,000, a cushion that sounded respectable until measured against the cost of one serious medical emergency, one major car repair, one sharp rent increase or one sustained period of financial instability. Dorothy represented the category policymakers describe with bloodless language like housing insecurity or vulnerability, but the reality was simpler. She was one bad break away from becoming one of the people the state claimed to be spending billions to protect. $37 billion had supposedly been mobilized in the name of preventing and reducing homelessness, yet Dorothy had not received some obvious shield from the system, and 187,000 people who were supposed to benefit from that spending were still without stable housing. The contrast was not subtle because the state had demonstrated extraordinary ability to allocate money and far less ability to prove that the money had produced the outcome used to justify the allocation. Newsom leaned toward the microphone and reached for the standard defense, arguing that homelessness was a national crisis, that California attracted a disproportionate share of the homeless population because of its climate and service network, and that implementation often occurred at the local level through cities and counties. It was the kind of answer that normally works because every piece of it contains enough truth to create distance between the governor and the result, allowing responsibility to dissolve into a maze of jurisdictions, agencies, social forces, migration patterns, housing costs, mental illness, and local administration. Vance refused the escape route and brought the responsibility directly back to the person sitting across from him. Newsom was the governor, he signed the budgets, he approved the allocations, and his own state auditor had raised serious questions about whether spending and program effectiveness were being adequately tracked. That was the point Newsom could not solve with another national comparison, because no amount of talk about Florida, Texas, climate, migration, or federal failure could change the basic management question of whether the government spending tens of billions knew clearly enough what those billions accomplished. And for the first time that night, the polished California performance showed a visible crack, not a collapse, not silence, but the brief tightening of a man discovering that charisma is a very weak defense against a spreadsheet. Vance then moved from current spending to the record of promises because the $37 billion question was not an isolated failure sitting outside Newsom's broader political history. He put multiple statements on the screen from different years, different offices, and different stages of Newsom's career, each one promising that homelessness could be ended, solved, or dramatically reduced, and each one followed by numbers that refused to cooperate with the rhetoric. As mayor of San Francisco, Newsom had promised an end to homelessness within a defined period, yet the city's homeless population later stood significantly higher. As governor, he again declared that homelessness could be solved, while California's homeless population grew, and in 2021, he promised to end family homelessness within 5 years, a deadline that passed without the promised result. Vance did not need to embellish the contrast because the sequence itself did the damage. Larger promises, larger budgets, larger programs, and outcomes that continued moving in the wrong direction. Then came the question that turned the entire argument from a dispute over policy into an indictment of management. At what point does this stop being a funding problem and become a leadership problem? Newsom tried to widen the frame again because widening the frame is what experienced politicians do when a narrow question becomes dangerous. Homelessness, he argued, was driven by housing costs, mental health failures, national policy, migration, and structural forces no single governor could control. Vance answered by narrowing it right back down, pointing out that Texas and Florida also had warm climates, also had major cities, also faced addiction, mental illness, migration, and housing pressure, yet neither had 187,000 homeless people. The difference, Vance argued, was not weather and it was not geography. The difference was management, a word so ordinary that it carried more force than another 10 minutes of policy jargon ever could. In the audience, the reaction was beginning to change. Not dramatically, not with some theatrical wave of applause, but in the much more dangerous way political support usually starts to move. People stopped automatically rewarding the familiar answer. A woman wearing a Sacramento City employee lanyard, someone who had come expecting to cheer for the governor she had voted for twice, shifted in her seat and did not clap. Then, Vance's tone changed, becoming quieter and more precise, almost as if he had reached the part of the record that was difficult to believe even after reading it more than once. In 2024, California Assemblyman Josh Hoover introduced Assembly Bill 293, a measure designed to require state agencies administering homelessness programs to report annually on spending and outcomes, how much money had been spent, where it had gone, and whether the programs had actually worked. The bill passed both chambers of the legislature, meaning the state's elected lawmakers had already recognized the obvious problem. Billions were moving through the system without a sufficiently clear public accounting of the results. Then Gavin Newsom vetoed it. Vance let that fact sit in the room before closing his laptop, because the next question was no longer about abstract policy design. It was about why any governor overseeing $37 billion in public spending would reject a law requiring the government to explain what the money produced. The question cut through every layer of bureaucratic insulation Newsom had relied on, because there were only so many possible answers, and none of them were flattering. Vance laid out the dilemma in brutal terms. Either the administration knew where the money went and did not want the public to see it, or the administration did not know where the money went and did not want the public to know that it did not know. He did not claim to know which explanation was correct, and that uncertainty was precisely what made the argument more damaging, because a functioning accountability system should have made the answer obvious long before a vice president opened a laptop on national television. Newsom reached for his water glass, a small movement that would have meant nothing in almost any other context, but under 14 high-definition cameras, after a direct question with no clean escape route, even controlled gestures began to look like what they were: time being purchased. The man who had spent his political life mastering motion suddenly needed his hands occupied because stillness, under that much scrutiny, risked looking like the absence of an answer. Vance then moved to November 2020, when California was under severe pandemic restrictions. Restaurants were closed, businesses were struggling, jobs were disappearing, and families were watching the rules reshape every ordinary part of life. During that period, Newsom was photographed dining at the French Laundry in Napa Valley, an expensive restaurant without a mask, in a gathering that became a symbol of the exact hypocrisy ordinary people believed they had been ordered to tolerate throughout the pandemic. Vance did not linger theatrically on the scandal because he did not need to. He treated it as another number in the ledger, another example of distance between the standards imposed on the public and the standards lived by the people imposing them. He moved from the restaurant to the governor's $3.7 million home in Fair Oaks, then to the broader contrast between political wealth, elite comfort, and the financial insecurity of people like Dorothy Chen, who was spending 56% of her monthly income on rent. The point was not that wealth itself disqualified Newsom from governing, but that a governor living far from the edge had spent tens of billions supposedly protecting people from that edge, and still could not clearly demonstrate why so many remained one emergency away from falling over it. Then came Newsom's own line, the one that sounded responsible in isolation and brutal when placed beside the record: "I'm not interested anymore in funding failure." Vance turned the sentence against him without needing to invent anything, arguing that Newsom had already spent $37 billion presiding over failure, then moved toward cutting funding and blaming cities once the results became impossible to defend. That was not leadership, Vance said. It was abandonment, the political habit of owning every program when the money is announced and disowning every outcome when the numbers arrive. The contradiction was almost too clean. The administration had demanded credit for investment. resisted stronger accountability, failed to produce the promised results, and then treated the failure as evidence that someone else had implemented the plan incorrectly. In other words, the money belonged to the governor when it was a headline, and the failure belonged to local government when it became a statistic. Newsom finally fought back with force, standing and returning to the style that had carried him through countless interviews, debates, and press conferences. Speed, energy, volume, program names, and the confidence of a man who understood that momentum can often substitute for resolution. He cited Project Homekey, arguing that motel and hotel conversions had created permanent housing at a lower cost than new construction and had housed roughly 16,000 people, then pointed to the CARE Act, the Encampment Resolution Fund, and thousands of encampment sites that had been cleared as evidence that California had built solutions at scale. His voice regained its rhythm as the programs came one after another, each acronym and initiative designed to reframe the conversation away from the unanswered total and toward visible components of government activity. He challenged Vance to name another state that had done more, because that was the strongest version of Newsom's case. Even if the problem remained enormous, California had acted aggressively, spent aggressively, and built aggressively. The gallery responded with a thin murmur of support, the sound of people who still wanted to believe the activity amounted to success, but had just heard too much arithmetic to return comfortably to the old assumption. Vance did not interrupt, because interruption would have helped Newsom by turning the exchange back into a contest of personalities. He waited until the list was finished and then focused on the phrase, built solutions at scale, because scale was exactly where Newsom's defense became weakest. The governor had once promised to build 3.5 million homes by 2025, yet the number actually built was around 640,000, roughly 18% of the target, a gap so enormous that calling it a stretch goal did not explain the results so much as underline how detached the promise had been from delivery. Vance reduced that failure to another simple comparison, saying 640,000 out of 3.5 million was not merely missing a stretch goal, but producing 18 cents on the dollar. The pattern, once again, was the same. Enormous promise, enormous announcement, enormous spending, and then a result that arrived far below the scale originally used to sell the plan. That was when the word vanished entered the argument and became the organizing verdict of the entire confrontation. Vance looked at the results rather than the intentions and listed what was missing. $37 billion that could not be consistently traced to clear outcomes, millions of promised homes that never materialized, a deadline to end family homelessness that expired without success, and an accountability measure that had been vetoed. "Everything you touch vanishes, Governor," he said, and the line worked because it did not depend on anger, volume, or some complicated ideological argument. It simply grouped the failures under one brutal pattern. The money vanished into a system without consistent outcome tracking. The houses vanished between promise and delivery. The promises vanished at their deadlines, and the only thing that stubbornly refused to disappear was the population of people still sleeping in tents, shelters, cars, and under overpasses across California. Then Vance turned the argument outward and asked the national question Newsom had spent the entire evening trying to make inevitable for different reasons. If this is what happens when he touches California, why should America want him touching the whole country? The moderator asked whether Newsom wanted to respond, and of course he did, because Gavin Newsom is not a politician who accepts silence when speed remains available. He went faster, louder, and broader, naming HHAP, Homekey, the Encampment Resolution Fund, the CARE Act, the Behavioral Health Bond, the Veterans Housing Initiative, and one program after another in a torrent of government activity. But the problem was no longer whether programs existed, because Vance had never argued that California had done nothing. The problem was whether the programs had produced results proportional to the money, the promises, and the years of authority behind them. Newsom named investments, but did not resolve the central accountability question, named initiatives, but did not erase the mismatch between expenditure and outcome, and named billions allocated without fully answering where the billions had gone in a way ordinary viewers could independently follow. The distinction between announcing a program and proving its effect had become the entire debate, and every additional acronym only made that distinction harder to ignore. Vance said nothing more because by that point more words would have weakened what the numbers had already done on their own. He closed the laptop, took a sip of water, set the glass down, and returned to the same small, controlled movements that had defined the entire exchange, the posture of a man who believed the accounting was complete, and the burden now belonged to the person whose books had failed to balance. There was no victory lap, no raised voice, no extended speech about humiliation, because the absence of celebration made the contrast even sharper. Newsom was still moving, still explaining, still producing names, while Vance had stopped because the calculation had reached its conclusion. In the green room, Jake Ellison's phone buzzed with a message from the 2028 finance chair, 4 words that carried more danger than any public insult. We need to talk. In 20 years of campaigns, Jake had seen that message before, and he knew it never meant someone wanted to discuss a successful night. The first time such a message arrives, a donor is usually nervous. The second time, someone is reconsidering support. The third time, everyone in the room already knows what happened and is only deciding how expensive the damage will become. Tonight, the people financing Newsom's national ambitions had watched the same exchange as millions of ordinary viewers and landed on the same brutal sequence: $37 billion, inconsistent tracking, weak outcome visibility, and no clean answer that could fit inside a 30-second clip. Within 72 hours, 2 clips from the town hall had generated approximately 38 million views, and neither clip depended on complicated policy interpretation or partisan context. The first was the arithmetic, roughly $197,000 per homeless person, followed by the question that had become almost impossible to escape: where did the money go? The second was the verdict: everything you touch vanishes, followed by the question of whether America wanted the same model expanded nationally. The arithmetic clip spread first because it reduced a bureaucratic problem into something any voter could understand without reading a budget, an audit, or a 100-page legislative report. People had heard for years that California spent billions on homelessness, but billions are politically useful precisely because they are too large for most people to visualize, so the number remains abstract, and abstraction protects failure. Dividing the total by the population changed that instantly, because now the public was not hearing about some distant ocean of government money. It was hearing a per-person figure large enough to compare with the price of an actual home in much of the country. The number became powerful, not because the underlying spending had been secret, but because the calculation made the scale of the failure feel personal, concrete, and almost absurdly simple. Fifth-grade arithmetic had done what years of oversight hearings, reports, press conferences, and political speeches had failed to do. It made the public ask the same question at the same time. The vanishing clip traveled differently because it was not primarily shared as evidence but as judgment, the condensed political interpretation of everything that had come before it. Republican operatives immediately saw what made it dangerous for 2028. The clip was short, visual, emotionally clear, and built around a pattern that could be applied to every future promise Newsom made, because once voters accept the idea that money, houses, promises, and accountability vanish around a candidate, every new proposal becomes vulnerable before the debate even starts. Democratic strategists did not need to admit that publicly, but privately, the problem was obvious. A clean attack is far harder to neutralize than a complicated accusation, especially when the target has already supplied the footage. The phrase became what campaign professionals call a preloaded attack, something so easy to understand that an opposing campaign could run it with almost no modification and trust viewers to complete the argument themselves. Newsom had spent years building a national image around California as proof of what progressive government could accomplish, and Vance had reduced the counterargument to one sentence: show us what survived. By the first week, California media began re-examining the same spending from the angle the town hall had forced into public view, not whether money had been allocated, but whether consistent, auditable outcome data existed across the programs receiving it. The Los Angeles Times pursued the $37 billion question across major homelessness initiatives, while editorial pages that had previously supported Newsom began demanding something more concrete than another acronym, another announcement, or another explanation of how complicated the problem was. The most damaging criticism was not that Californians had learned something completely new, but that they had heard familiar facts reorganized in a way the political system had carefully avoided. One giant expenditure, one worsening crisis, one accountability gap, one governor. The Sacramento Bee's message was devastating precisely because it stripped the drama away and returned to the basic demand taxpayers should never have had to make in the first place. Tell us where the money went and do it in language that does not require a government glossary. Once a governor's own political environment begins asking for an answer, that is not an acronym. The acronyms have stopped functioning as protection. By the second week, the political damage had moved from media coverage into the metric that presidential campaigns care about long before voters start casting ballots: electability. Newsom could remain the nominal frontrunner in early Democratic primary polling and still face a deeper problem if donors, bundlers, consultants, and party professionals began believing that the Republican attack against him had already been written, tested, and distributed for free. In one survey, his perceived strength against a Republican nominee dropped sharply, and the number attached to the collapse was not a scandal date, a witness name, or a leaked document. It was simply $37 billion. 3 California real estate donors who had collectively raised millions for Newsom's exploratory efforts requested private conversations with the finance team, not yet to withdraw, but to ask the question that comes before withdrawal. What is the answer? Because if a campaign cannot answer the most obvious attack before the opposition starts spending money, donors begin to wonder what exactly their money is being asked to protect. Then the state auditor announced an expanded review of major homelessness programs covering billions in expenditures and designed to trace money from allocation through implementation to measurable outcome. The timing intensified the damage because even a review presented as routine accountability now looked like confirmation that the central problem was serious enough to require another layer of scrutiny. The political meaning was unavoidable. After years of spending, after years of declarations, after repeated promises that the state was building solutions at scale, the government was still trying to create a clearer map of what happened between the appropriation and the result. That is the administrative nightmare hidden inside the $37 billion question, because the worst answer is not always that money was stolen or deliberately concealed. Sometimes the worst answer is that a government became so comfortable spending in the name of urgency that it never built the discipline required to know whether urgency was producing success. And once the public realizes that possibility, every billion-dollar announcement begins sounding less like action and more like another number waiting to disappear. By week 3, Newsom did something he had not done in 7 years as governor. He held a press conference focused almost entirely on homelessness spending, lasting roughly 45 minutes and filled with slides, data tables, program by program explanations, and the kind of numerical detail that had been missing from the political defense during the town hall. By any reasonable standard, the presentation was more substantive than the torrent of program names he had offered under pressure, because for the first time, the administration attempted to place dollars, programs, and outcomes together in a form designed to answer the criticism directly. But that created a new problem instead of solving the old one, because if the information had always been available in a clear, organized form, why had it taken a televised humiliation to produce it? And if the information had not been readily available until the governor's staff spent 3 weeks assembling it, then Vance's accusation had already gained the only confirmation it needed. The administration had not maintained the kind of standing, transparent accounting that should have existed before the money was spent. The press conference may have improved the answer, but it could not erase the fact that the answer arrived only after the question became politically lethal. Politico captured the problem in the kind of headline campaigns dread because it turns delay itself into evidence. Newsom finally answers the $37 billion question 3 weeks late and $37 billion short. From that point forward, Democratic rivals did not even need to attack him directly, because they could simply begin emphasizing accountability, results-based governance, measurable outcomes, and the principle that every taxpayer dollar must be tracked, each phrase functioning as a polite substitute for the accusation no one yet wanted to say openly. The 2028 primary was still far enough away for everyone to pretend the knives were not out, but political language had already shifted, and whenever rivals start campaigning against your weakness without using your name, the weakness has become part of the race. Assembly Bill 293, the accountability measure Newsom had previously vetoed, returned, and this time the governor signed it quietly, without the celebration normally attached to legislation a politician wants to claim as his own. That signature was not the end of the controversy. It was the written admission that accountability should never have been optional in the first place. The governor had once rejected a requirement that agencies report what they spent and whether the spending worked. Then, after the town hall turned that decision into a national liability, he signed the accountability measure with none of the usual ceremony that accompanies legislation a politician wants voters to remember. There was no triumphant stage, no carefully framed group of supporters, no extended speech about transparency, because this was not a law Newsom could comfortably celebrate without reminding everyone that he had previously stood in its way. The signing received only limited coverage, a short item buried far from the front page attention the original veto had drawn, but the difference in placement told its own story. The veto had been an assertion of executive judgment. The later signature looked like a concession extracted by public pressure, and a question the governor should never have needed 3 weeks to answer. Between those two decisions sat the entire political problem Vance had exposed, a government willing to spend enormous sums before building an equally serious system for proving what those sums accomplished. That distance between vetoing accountability and later signing it was the distance between Newsom's preferred image and the record that image could no longer fully conceal. It was the distance between the governor who said he was no longer interested in funding failure, and the governor whose administration had overseen tens of billions in homelessness spending without the consistent outcome tracking necessary to prove success at the same scale. It was the distance between declaring that California was a model for the nation and being forced on national television to explain why one of the state's most visible crises had grown while the spending surrounding it exploded. Vance had not created that distance, and he had not manufactured the numbers. He had simply placed the promises, the expenditures, the missing accountability, and the results close enough together that the public could finally see the gap. Once that happened, the polished language of innovation and future leadership could no longer float above the ledger without being dragged back down by the arithmetic underneath it. That was the real reason the confrontation damaged Newsom beyond one bad television appearance, because politicians recover from bad nights all the time, but they have a much harder time recovering from a frame that reorganizes their entire record. Before the town hall, homelessness spending in California could be discussed as a complicated collection of programs, jurisdictions, emergency needs, local failures, housing shortages, behavioral health challenges, and implementation disputes, each one real enough to prevent responsibility from settling in one place. After the town hall, the public had a simpler frame: $37 billion, 187,000 homeless people, inadequate tracking, a vetoed accountability bill, and a governor who could name programs faster than he could explain the total result. That frame was politically devastating because it did not require voters to reject every program or deny every success. They only had to accept that at the scale of the spending, the state should have been able to produce a clearer answer. Newsom could defend individual initiatives, celebrate people housed through HomeKey, cite encampments cleared, and point to mental health reforms, but none of those examples erased the central management failure exposed by the larger number. And that was exactly where Vance's attack remained strongest, because he was not arguing that California had literally done nothing, a claim Newsom could easily defeat with one list of programs and several legitimate accomplishments. He was arguing that California had spent like a government capable of solving the crisis while measuring results, like a government still improvising its way through it. And that distinction survived every rebuttal Newsom offered. 16,000 people housed through one program could be real and worthwhile, while the broader system still failed to explain how tens of billions translated into statewide outcomes. Both facts could exist at the same time, and pretending one canceled the other was precisely the kind of political accounting Vance had rejected. The same was true of encampments cleared, treatment initiatives launched, and bonds approved, because activity is not the same thing as resolution, and expenditure is not the same thing as effectiveness. A government can be extraordinarily busy while remaining unable to prove that its busyness is changing the underlying trend. Newsom's defenders could argue correctly that homelessness is one of the hardest policy problems in America, shaped by housing costs, addiction, severe mental illness, disability, family breakdown, migration, local zoning, and the failures of federal, state, and municipal institutions at the same time. But complexity is not an excuse for weak accounting. If anything, complexity makes rigorous tracking more necessary, because without it, politicians can always point to the hardest part of the problem whenever someone asks why the result did not match the spending. California did not need a simplistic solution, but taxpayers had every right to expect a comprehensible explanation of where the money went, which programs worked, which failed, what was changed, and why billions continued flowing through systems whose effectiveness could not always be clearly demonstrated. Vance's question was powerful because it did not pretend homelessness could be solved by one spreadsheet, but it insisted that a government spending $37 billion should at least be capable of producing one. Newsom had spent years asking the public to trust the ambition of California's response, and Vance forced him to confront the far less glamorous question of whether ambition without disciplined measurement had become another form of political self-protection. That is why the arithmetic clip outlived the news cycle, because the number became a shorthand not only for homelessness spending, but for a wider suspicion about government itself. Voters who already believed institutions spent too much and measured too little suddenly had a clean example, one involving billions of dollars, a visible crisis, and a governor with national ambitions sitting directly across from the calculation. The issue was no longer confined to Sacramento budgets or California policy debates. It had become a national test of whether the politicians selling the California model could explain the price of the California model. Every time Newsom spoke about scale, Vance's number waited in the background. Every time he spoke about national leadership, the vetoed accountability bill followed him into the conversation. A presidential campaign built around competence cannot easily carry a question this basic for 18 months. Where did the money go? And the problem was made worse by the fact that Newsom's eventual response, however substantive, arrived after the pressure rather than before it. Leadership looks strongest when accountability is built into the system before a scandal, before a viral clip, before donors call, and before national audiences begin doing the math themselves. Once transparency appears only after humiliation, transparency starts looking reactive. The 45-minute press conference, the data tables, the program breakdowns, the expanded audit, and the signing of the accountability measure all may have improved the state's position. But politically, they also reinforced the sequence Vance had laid out. First came the spending, then came the worsening crisis, then came the questions about tracking, then came the veto, then came the town hall, and only after the national damage came the fuller accounting and the new willingness to sign what had previously been rejected. That sequence was not invented by an opposition campaign, it was the administration's own timeline, and timelines are difficult things to spin once the public begins reading them in order. The entire confrontation therefore ended where it began, not with a scandalous revelation, not with a criminal accusation, and not with some hidden document pulled from a locked drawer, but with one simple question sitting on top of an enormous pile of public money. Vance had asked where the $37 billion went, and everything that followed, the viral clips, the media investigations, the donor anxiety, the expanded audit, the press conference, the reintroduced accountability bill, and the quiet signature, happened because the original answer had not been ready when it should have been. Newsom could still campaign, still raise money, still argue that California had achieved more than critics admitted, and still insist that complicated problems require patience, but he could no longer pretend the accountability question belonged to someone else. The man who wanted to present California as proof that his model worked had been forced to spend weeks proving that his own administration understood where the money had gone, and that was the final meaning of the word Vance had attached to the entire record, the word that turned spending, housing promises, missed deadlines, and accountability failures into one political judgment that would follow Newsom long after the cameras shut off: vanishing.